A year after we buried Nina, I finally called a plumber. Not because I'd accepted the grief. Not because I was moving on. The faucet in her art studio had been dripping for 11 months and 3 weeks, and I'd let it drip because fixing it meant walking through that door again. It meant standing in the room where she used to paint until midnight, where the smell of turpentine and linseed oil still lived in the walls like a ghost that refused to be evicted. I was sitting in the second pew of St. Augustine's, the same pew where I'd sat at her funeral, when my phone buzzed against my thigh. The number was Toby's, the plumber. I almost let it ring. Mr. Spencer. His voice was wrong, not the easy, unhurried drawl of a man discussing pipe fittings. This was the voice of someone who'd seen something he hadn't been paid to see. I need you to come home right now. I stood up, already moving toward the aisle. Toby, what's? I found something, sir. A long pause, the sound of him breathing carefully like a man choosing his next words from a very short list. Behind the wall, behind the drywall in the studio. What kind of something? He didn't answer that directly, and somehow the fact that he didn't answer was worse than anything he could have said. Mr. Spencer. Another pause, longer this time. Whatever you do, don't come home alone. The line went quiet. I was already walking to my car. I drove the 20 minutes from St. Augustine's in what felt like 20 seconds. The November sky above the freeway was the color of old pewter, and I don't remember a single traffic light. My hands knew the route home so well they didn't need me. My mind was somewhere else entirely, in that room, behind that door I hadn't opened since the morning in October when they carried her out. Nina's studio had been exactly as she'd left it for a full year. Her half-finished canvas still on the easel, her brushes stiff and ruined in their jar because no one had cleaned them, a coffee mug with a ring of dried residue at the bottom. I'd walked past that door every single day for 12 months, and not once had I turned the handle. Some part of me believed, not rationally, not consciously, but in that unreasonable place where grief lives, that if the door stayed shut, something of her was still in there, still painting, still alive. Toby's truck was in the driveway when I pulled in. He met me on the front step before I could fish out my keys, still wearing his work gloves, sawdust across the front of his shirt. He was a big man, calm by nature, unhurried by profession, but the composure was gone. What had replaced it wasn't panic exactly. It was the careful stillness of a man who has seen something he can't unsee and is trying very hard to hold himself together while he waits for someone else to take responsibility for it. Mr. Spencer. He stepped back from the door. I'm sorry. I want you to know I didn't touch anything after I found it. I wasn't sure if I should have even called. But I couldn't just. Show me. He led me through the front hall, past the framed photographs Nina had arranged on the wall, our trip to Porto, her niece's wedding, the year Oliver turned 16 and pretended to hate every photograph but kept every single one. Past all of it, to the door at the end of the hall. The door with the dripping faucet behind it. He pushed it open. The room had been violated. There was no softer word for it. The pale drop cloth Nina used to protect the hardwood floors had been rolled back near the far wall, behind where her storage shelves used to stand, and the wall itself. The entire section of drywall between the studio and what I'd always assumed was dead space above the garage was gone. Not cracked. Not opened. Gone. Stripped back to the bare wooden studs, exposing a darkness on the other side that had no business being there. Pipe access is up here, Toby said, pointing to the copper line along the top of the exposed cavity. His flashlight swept down, but Mr. Spencer. The beam landed on it. A space. Deliberate, finished, sealed. Roughly 5 feet wide and deep enough to stand in, hidden behind the wall of Nina's studio, accessible only through this section of drywall. The interior surface was painted, not the rough, unpainted backside of standard drywall, but deliberately finished, as though someone had taken great care to make a room that would never be seen. And in the far corner of that hidden space, mounted flush against the back wall at roughly chest height, a small biometric lockbox. Matte black, clean, not dusty, not aged, recently installed. Nina had built this. I didn't touch it, Toby said again quietly. Didn't know if I should. But sir, your wife, he stopped, tried again. How long had you two been married? 38 years. He nodded slowly and said nothing else, because there was nothing else to say. He handed me the flashlight, stepped back into the hallway and closed the studio door behind him, giving me the room. The lockbox read my thumbprint on the first try. Of course it did. Inside, a handheld dictaphone, the old kind, boxy and reliable, the kind that never fails. And beneath it, a ledger. Thick, leather-bound, Nina's precise handwriting filling page after page in columns and notations I didn't yet understand. I picked up the dictaphone. My hands, I noticed, were perfectly steady, which surprised me. I've learned since then that the body sometimes goes very quiet in the moments just before it's destroyed. I pressed play. Her voice came out of that small machine and filled the room she used to paint in, and I sat down on the drop cloth on the floor because my legs simply stopped working. Max, a breath, the particular way she said my name when she was frightened but didn't want me to know. If you're hearing this, then I was right to be afraid, and I need you to listen to every single word. My heart didn't fail on its own. They made sure of it. I sat on that floor for a long time. The faucet had stopped dripping, Toby had fixed it while I wasn't paying attention, and the studio was absolutely silent. The smell of her oil paints was everywhere, and for just a moment, the hard angles of the room blurred and softened, and I was back in this same studio 20 years ago, watching her work, asking why she always painted with the window open in November, and she'd laughed at me, brush in hand, paint on her cheek, because cold air makes the colors truer, Max, honestly. The front door slammed. I was back. The room was cold and broken-walled and empty of everything but me and a dictaphone and the slow unwinding of a life I thought I understood. I looked down at the ledger in my lap. Oliver's name was on the first page. Arthur's was on the second. And I understood, with a clarity that felt almost physical, like a hand closing around my throat, that the people who had sat at my dinner table last Sunday, who had refilled my water glass and asked how I was sleeping, who had used Nina's death as a reason to check on me every other day with covered casseroles and careful questions about my health. They had keys to my front door. If you're hearing this, my heart didn't fail on its own. They made sure of it. I had been letting the killers comfort me. Now, before we go any further, I need to take one breath with you. If you are still here, still with me in this room, on this floor, with that voice coming out of that small machine, I want to know where in the world you're watching this from. Leave it in the comments right now. I read every single one, and more than you'd think. These stories find the people who need them most. Like and subscribe if you want to follow Max all the way to the end of this, because I promise you, where this goes next is somewhere none of us expected. In the days that followed, I would learn that Nina hadn't simply left a message. She had built a case. The ledger documented months of quiet, meticulous investigation, financial transfers she wasn't supposed to notice, a prescription she wasn't supposed to question, a friendship of 40 years she had started to look at from a terrible new angle. I would learn what she knew about Fiona. I would learn what Oliver had done with money that wasn't his. And I would learn, most devastatingly of all, the one detail Nina had saved for the final pages of the ledger, written in smaller letters than the rest, as though she'd hoped she was wrong right up until the moment she wrote it down. But that night, I knew only 3 things. Nina had been murdered. The people who killed her were still in my life, still at my table, still checking on my health with warm smiles and careful eyes. And somewhere in my house right now, they were probably listening. I looked up at the clock on the studio wall, the one Oliver had brought over 2 weeks ago, A gift, something cheerful for the room Dad and I noticed for the first time. The small red light blinking in its lower left corner. Too small to be a low battery warning. Too steady to be anything innocent. The clock wasn't just keeping time, it was listening. I discovered the bug at 11:47 p.m. But that comes later. First, I had to survive dinner. I had exactly 4 minutes between hanging up with Toby and hearing the key turn in my front lock. 4 minutes to close the studio door, to hide the dictaphone and the ledger inside the false bottom of my drafting case, the old leather one Nina had bought me for our 20th anniversary, which no one else knew had a false bottom because I'd built it myself. 4 minutes to wash my face, pour 2 fingers of whiskey I had no intention of drinking, and settle into the armchair in the living room with the specific posture of a man who had spent a quiet evening doing nothing of consequence. The lock turned, the door swung open. Dad, Oliver's voice, that particular pitch he used when performing concern, slightly too loud, slightly too warm. We were in the neighborhood. Fiona wanted to check on you. They never called ahead. In 11 months of welfare checks, they had never once called ahead, and I had always read this as thoughtlessness. Now I understood it differently. You don't announce a surveillance visit. Oliver came in first, in his way, restless, unable to fully inhabit any room, one hand already reaching for his phone before he'd finished stepping through the door. He'd lost weight since the funeral. The designer jacket hung slightly wrong on his shoulders, and the circles beneath his eyes had deepened from gray to something closer to purple. He looked like a man who hadn't slept cleanly in months. I knew now why. Fiona came in behind him. She was, as always, impeccably composed. Dark hair, precise posture, a cashmere wrapped the color of winter fog. She crossed the room and embraced me before I could stand, and her arms were exactly the right tightness, her cheek pressed to mine for exactly the right duration. A flawless performance. Her hug felt cold, practiced, the careful rehearsal of a woman already measuring herself for widow's black. Max, she pulled back, holding my arm, studying my face with an expression of such practiced tenderness I almost believed it myself. You look tired. Are you sleeping? Well enough, I said, which was true. I had not yet discovered that my supplements weren't supplements. You should be taking those magnesium capsules Oliver brought last week, she said, moving to the kitchen without being invited, which was also her way. They're specifically formulated for grief-related insomnia. I read the research myself. Fiona reads everything, Oliver said, in the tone of a man complimenting his wife from a great emotional distance. I watched her open my kitchen cabinet, the third one from the left, exactly where she'd suggested I store the supplements 2 visits ago, and take the amber bottle down with the familiarity of someone who had organized that shelf herself. Her thumb rested exactly over the prescription warning label. Here, she said, setting the bottle on the counter, don't forget tonight. I nodded and said nothing, and made a decision I didn't fully understand yet. I would not be taking those capsules again. Not until I knew what was in them. Oliver ordered food without asking, Thai, from the place around the corner that Nina had loved, which I was certain he knew. And for the next 90 minutes I sat across the dinner table from my son and his wife, and performed the role of a grieving man who suspected nothing. It is a strange and specific kind of acting, not theatrical, the opposite of theatrical, actually. The entire effort goes into subtraction, removing every flicker of knowledge from your eyes, every tightness from your jaw, every half-second hesitation before you answer a question. You have to become slightly emptier than you actually are. You have to make yourself hollow enough that there is nothing for them to find. I have since learned this is called counter-surveillance. That night, I simply called it survival. Oliver talked about the firm, the architectural firm I had built over 40 years alongside Arthur, the one my name was still on the door of. He talked about it in the careful, circling way of someone approaching a topic they've been told not to approach directly. The partners are asking questions, Dad, about succession, about structure. Nothing urgent, just people want to feel stable. He said the word stable, the way you'd hand a man a mirror you hope will confuse him. We just want what's best for your health, he said, somewhere between the spring rolls and the main course. What's best for you? That's all any of this is. I looked at my son across the table. This man I had taught to ride a bicycle, whose college application essays I had edited at this very table at midnight, and I looked for the person I remembered. He was in there somewhere, behind the nervous phone checking, behind the performance, behind whatever terror had driven him into this arrangement. I could see the outline of him, faint and diminishing, like a building being demolished from the inside. He couldn't hold my gaze for more than 3 seconds at a time. Oliver looked at me with what he wanted me to read as love. I recognized it now as calculation. He was estimating how much longer he'd have to do this. I excused myself once during dinner, bathroom, I said, and stood in the hallway for 30 seconds doing nothing but breathing, looking at the clock Oliver had brought 2 weeks ago, the one mounted on the wall above the console table, between the photograph of Nina at the Porto waterfront and the architectural drawing I'd framed in the early years of the firm. A clean, modern face, simple numerals. Oliver had said it was cheerful. I looked at the lower left corner and saw the light, small and red and steady, the kind of light that serves no clock function I had ever encountered in 60 years of living. I went back to the table and finished dinner. They left at 9:30. Fiona embraced me again at the door, that same precise pressure, that same careful warmth, and Oliver patted my shoulder in the slightly too firm way of a man who has been coached on how to appear affectionate. "Call us if you need anything," he said, "anything at all." I told him I would. I watched the car reverse down the driveway. I stood at the front window until the tail lights disappeared at the end of the road. Then I stood there for another full minute without moving, because I had just spent 90 minutes performing and the performance wasn't quite over yet. Old instinct. You don't break character until the audience is genuinely gone. Then I got my Swiss Army knife from the kitchen drawer and went to look at the clock. The casing came off in 2 sections. Standard mounting bracket, 4 screws, nothing unusual until the panel separated and I saw what was behind the display unit. It was small, smaller than I'd imagined, the size of a thumbnail really, matte black with a single status light and a component I recognized, even with my layman's understanding, as a wireless transmitter. It had been integrated with the clock's own power supply, which meant it never needed a battery change. It meant no one ever needed to come back for it. It meant it had been running since the day Oliver mounted it on my wall. I stood in my hallway with the dismantled clock in my hands and thought about what that meant in practical terms. Every phone call I'd made from this hallway, every conversation that had drifted in from the living room, Toby's call from the church, I'd taken that in the car, thank God, but everything since. The 11 months before that. Every moment of grief I had believed was private. They had listened to all of it. I set the clock face down on the console table and looked at the small transmitter in my palm. It was still active. The status light was still on, which meant it was still streaming to wherever it streamed, which meant that whoever was on the other end knew I had just taken it apart. I considered that for a moment. Then I carried it to the kitchen, set it on the counter next to the sink, and turned on the radio. A late-night jazz program. I adjusted the volume until the music would cover any ambient sound from that corner of the room, and I left the transmitter there, pointed at nothing more incriminating than a dripping faucet and a Chet Baker recording, while I went to the studio. Let them listen to jazz. I sat on the floor of Nina's art studio, the drop cloth still pulled back, the wall still open to the studs, Toby's tools still stacked neatly in the corner because I'd asked him to return tomorrow, and I opened the ledger for the second time. Her handwriting was very even, Nina had always written that way, with the careful deliberateness of someone who knew the value of a record. Columns, dates, amounts. Notations in the margins that I was only beginning to decipher. But the name on the first page was Oliver's. And beside it a number. An offshore account number, 8 digits, and beside that in red ink, which Nina only used for certainty, a transfer total that I read 3 times before my brain would process it. $2,400,000. Not stolen in one motion. Taken in increments carefully over 14 months through the firm's infrastructure accounts. Small enough per transaction to avoid automated flags. Large enough accumulated to constitute an entire life's ruination. My son had been robbing me for over a year. And Nina had known. She'd been quietly, meticulously building a case alone in this room, while I worked in the next room over and the faucet dripped and Arthur came for dinner on Thursdays and Oliver called on Sundays, and she had said nothing to me. And I had asked myself in the 6 hours since I found this room why she'd said nothing, why she hadn't told me, and I kept arriving at the same answer, the only one that made any sense. She was trying to protect me. She was afraid of what I would do if I knew, afraid that I would confront Oliver, confront Arthur, confront all of them, loud and direct, the way I'd handled every conflict in my life, and in doing so, hand them the warning they needed to disappear every shred of evidence and replace it with something far worse. She was buying time, gathering proof, building something airtight. And then she ran out of time. I turned the page. Arthur's name was at the top, and below it, in Nina's careful red ink, a single line that rearranged every memory I had of the last 40 years. He was in the house the morning I took ill. I did not sleep. Sometime around 3 in the morning, I made coffee and sat at the kitchen table, the ledger open in front of me, the transmitter still broadcasting Chet Baker to whoever was awake enough to listen. Outside, the neighborhood was completely still, the kind of quiet that feels less like peace and more like held breath. I had a son who had robbed me blind, a daughter-in-law whose past I hadn't yet examined but whose present was already damning enough, a best friend of 40 years who had been in my house on the morning Nina collapsed, and somewhere in this city, a cardiologist who had signed a death certificate for a perfectly healthy woman and called it cardiac failure. I had a transmitter in my kitchen, and likely more devices I hadn't found yet. I had a dictaphone with my dead wife's voice on it, telling me she had been murdered. What I did not have was a single person I could trust. By morning, that had to change. Because somewhere between the Thai food and the cashmere wrap and my son's careful 3-second gaze, I had realized something that shifted the entire geometry of my situation. They thought I was still in the dark. And the only advantage I had, the only one, was making absolutely certain they kept thinking that. The tea I'd barely touched had gone cold. I raised it anyway, looked at the amber surface, and set it back down. It tasted faintly metallic. And I thought about what had happened to Nina. I left the house at 6:14 in the morning wearing my oldest coat. Not the tweed. The anonymous one, dark, unremarkable, the kind of thing a man wears when he wants to disappear into a city that isn't paying attention yet. I left the radio running in the kitchen, tuned to the same late-night jazz program that had cycled into an early morning repeat. I left the transmitter pointed at the counter. I left every light exactly as I'd found it. And I left through the back garden gate, the one that opens onto the service lane behind the row of houses, which I had not used in, I stopped counting, years. Nina used to joke that the back gate existed purely for the recycling bins and neighborhood cats. I used it now because it had no line of sight to the street. I had found Gideon's name the only way that made sense under the circumstances, not through a search on my home network, not through any device that had ever been inside that house. I'd driven to a library 2 suburbs over the previous afternoon while Oliver and Fiona were still in transit, used a public terminal with a guest login, and searched for exactly what I needed. Disgraced, ex-law enforcement, fraud investigation background, private practice. The disgraced part was deliberate. A man with a clean record and active law enforcement ties was a man with obligations I couldn't afford. A man who'd been pushed out had something to prove and no one to report to. Those are different motivations, and in my position, I needed someone whose loyalty could be purchased not with money alone, but with the specific currency of a case that could rebuild a reputation. Gideon's disciplinary record was public. A botched fraud investigation 8 years ago that had collapsed under procedural errors he maintained. In a single published interview I found in a regional paper's archive, were not his errors at all. He'd been made the exit point for a failure that ran considerably higher up the chain. He'd never been formally cleared, never been reinstated, and had operated since then as a private investigator working cases that, by his own description, other people had already given up on. His office was above a dry cleaner on a street that smelled of steam and solvent, the kind of building that keeps no visible records of who comes and goes. I was there by 7. He answered the door in the faded trench coat, wearing it indoors, which I would later understand was simply how he existed, and looked at me for a long moment without speaking. Heavyset, unhurried, with the 5 o'clock shadow of a man who had stopped fighting that particular battle years ago. His eyes, though. His eyes were doing something very different from the rest of his face. They were moving over me the way a structural engineer looks at a building, not at the surface, at the load-bearing elements. "Mr. Spencer," he said, not a question, he'd already looked me up. "You know who I am. Silver-haired architect, wife died 10 months ago, son is Oliver Spencer, business partner is Arthur." He stopped, tilted his head slightly. "You didn't come here to tell me about yourself. Come in." The office was exactly what the building promised, functional, stripped of anything decorative, every surface covered in the organized density of a man who processes information in layers. Files, photographs, printed records, a corkboard along the entire left wall, a coffee maker that appeared to run continuously. He poured 2 cups without asking and sat across from me, and I told him everything. Not quickly, not in the compressed, anxious way of a man afraid of being disbelieved. I'd spent the drive over deciding how to present it methodically, in the order the evidence supported, leading with Nina's dictaphone recording and the ledger before I touched the transmitter or the supplements or any of the rest of it. Evidence first. Emotion second. I'd built an architectural firm from a drafting table and a borrowed office. I knew how to make a case. He didn't interrupt. He made 2 notes, both times when I mentioned specific names. He drank his coffee and listened with the stillness of someone who had trained himself to receive information without contaminating it with his own reactions. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Then, Mr. Spencer, you came here wondering whether you're being irrational, whether the grief has made you construct something that isn't there." I didn't answer because it was precise enough to sting. "You aren't paranoid," he said. "You're prey. There's a meaningful difference, and the difference is this. Paranoid men imagine the mechanism. You found it in the wall." He took the supplement bottle from me. I'd brought it in a sealed plastic bag, which he noted with a brief nod of approval, and held it to the light, turning it slowly. "Dr. Aris prescribed these." "Issued the prescription, yes. Fiona introduced him as a specialist. He's been managing what she called my cardiac monitoring since Nina died." I paused. I never asked for cardiac monitoring. "No," Gideon said. "You wouldn't have." He set the bottle on the desk. "Grief-adjacent medical intervention is extraordinarily easy to normalize. A concerned family, a compliant physician, a patient who is already emotionally compromised and disinclined to question people who appear to be caring for him." He looked at the bottle again. "I know someone. Toxicology background, works independently, deeply uninterested in professional visibility. I'd like her to open these before we touch anything else." "You think they're I think a cardiologist with no prior relationship to you appeared in your life immediately after your wife's death, at the introduction of a woman whose interest in your estate is considerable, and began prescribing you supplements that no one else has ever examined. He met my eyes. These aren't vitamins, Mr. Spencer. At minimum, they're a mechanism of control. At maximum. He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't need to. The pills weren't vitamins. Sitting in that office, watching Gideon turn that amber bottle in the light, I understood with a cold and absolute clarity. They were a slow execution, measured in milligrams, administered with a glass of water and a concerned smile. "Don't take any more of them," he said, already writing on a notepad. "Beginning now. If anyone asks, you forgot. You've been forgetful lately." A brief, grim pause. Let them believe that. We talked for another hour. Gideon had questions, the kind that arrived from unexpected angles, the way good investigation always moves, triangulating from the periphery inward. He asked about Arthur's financial position in the firm, about the timing of Oliver's debt relative to specific firm decisions, about whether Nina had ever expressed unease about Arthur in the years before she died. That last question stopped me. "Once," I said, "about 4 years ago. She said Arthur looked at her sometimes in a way that made her feel like an argument he'd never finished having. I dismissed it at the time, attributed it to Arthur's occasional brusqueness, to the specific social friction of a long business partnership lived in close proximity. I told her she was misreading him." Gideon wrote something down, and she dropped it. "Yes, because you dismissed it." The sentence landed without accusation. He said it the way a doctor states a diagnosis, not cruelly, but without the softening that allows a patient to avoid the implications. "Yes," I said again. "All right," he closed the notepad. "I'll need 3 days for the toxicology. In the meantime, do not alter your behavior in any way they can measure. Use the supplements bottle, keep it visible, move it occasionally, let them see it in the cabinet when they visit. But don't consume anything from it. I'll provide a substitute capsule of identical appearance. You have one available." I've worked cases like this before. He said it without elaboration, and I didn't press. "There's one more thing you need to do today, Mr. Spencer, and it is arguably more urgent than anything we've discussed." He slid a name across the desk on a piece of notepaper. "Valerie Marsh, estate law. She handled my sister's property dispute 4 years ago. She is precise, discreet, and she does not lose." He tapped the paper. "Call her before you leave this building. Today, not tomorrow." "Why the urgency?" He leaned back in his chair and looked at me with the expression of a man delivering news he wishes were different. "Because if Arthur and Oliver have already initiated a legal competency challenge, and based on everything you've described I believe they have or will imminently, there are filing windows you don't know about. Deadlines that, once passed, give them legal footholds that are extraordinarily difficult to dislodge." He paused. "Call Valerie. Now, while we're still in the window where calling her makes a difference." She answered on the second ring. I made the call from Gideon's office, standing at the window that overlooked the street below. The dry cleaner's steam rising past the glass. The early morning foot traffic of people who had no idea what was being discussed 6 feet above their heads. Valerie Marsh had the voice of someone who had spent decades in rooms where precision was the only currency that mattered. Measured, unhurried, but with an underlying efficiency that conveyed clearly that her time was organized around outcomes rather than courtesy. I gave her the outline in 4 minutes. She asked 6 questions. Then she was quiet for a moment that felt considerably longer than it was. "Mr. Spencer, I need to see you in person this afternoon. 2 o'clock, my office. Bring every original document you have access to, the ledger, the dictaphone recording, anything in Nina's handwriting. Don't bring copies. Originals only." "I understand. And I need to tell you something directly, because We don't have time for gradual disclosure. Another brief pause. If a competency petition has already been drafted, and given what you've described about the forged financial activity, I believe it has, there is a filing deadline that governs your ability to counterpetition with independent psychiatric documentation. That deadline is the 15th. I looked at the wall calendar Gideon kept above his corkboard. A utilitarian thing, no photographs, just numbered squares with notations in pencil. Today was the 9th. 6 days, I said. 6 days, Valerie confirmed. If you don't act by the 15th, they take everything legally. The firm, the accounts, your medical decision-making authority, all of it transfers to the petitioners pending the hearing. And once that transfer is in place, Mr. Spencer, revering it is a process measured in months, during which time you would have very limited ability to act on your own behalf. I stood at that window and absorbed this with the specific quality of focus that arrives when the acceptable options reduce to one. 2 o'clock, I said, I'll be there. I left Gideon's building through the back stairwell and walked 2 blocks before I flagged a cab rather than returning to my car immediately, a precaution that was probably unnecessary and that I took anyway. The city moved around me in its ordinary morning rhythm. Deliveries, commuters, a woman walking a small dog that stopped to investigate every crack in the pavement. The complete indifference of a world that had no idea what was being built against one man inside it. 6 days. I had a toxicologist examining what had been administered to me daily for 10 months. I had an estate lawyer who used the word deadline, the way a surgeon uses the word now. I had a disgraced investigator who looked at a supplement bottle and saw a murder weapon. And I had a house full of bugs I hadn't finished finding yet. The cab turned onto the main boulevard, and I watched the city through the window, and I thought about Oliver, about the way he couldn't hold my gaze, about the debt, $2,400,000, and the man who held that debt over him like a hand around a throat. About the terrified, hollowed-out version of my son I'd sat across from at dinner, while Fiona monitored my supplement bottle and Arthur waited somewhere in the background, warm and impeccably dressed, with his silver-headed cane and his smile that never once reached his eyes. Arthur had been my best friend for 40 years. He had been in my house the morning Nina collapsed. I checked the bottom of the cab receipt when the driver handed it back, force of habit, verifying the numbers, and caught myself thinking, my name is on a legal document somewhere that I haven't signed. I can feel it the way you feel a change in weather, something in the pressure of the air. The cab pulled to the corner near where I'd parked. I had 6 days. The 15th was not a deadline. It was a detonator. Valerie's office was on the 14th floor of a building that had no visible signage at street level, the kind of professional address that announced its exclusivity through deliberate understatement. I arrived 12 minutes early and spent those 12 minutes in the lobby doing something I had not done since my first year in business. I sat with my hands open on my knees and simply waited, because there was nothing productive I could do in those minutes, and I had learned, somewhere in the long discipline of building things, that men who cannot tolerate stillness make catastrophic decisions in the gaps between actions. At 2 o'clock precisely, an assistant led me through a corridor lined with closed doors and no decoration, into an office that was almost entirely glass on 2 sides, the city spread below it like a blueprint. Valerie Marsh was smaller than her voice had suggested. Late 50s, silver-streaked hair pulled back with the no-nonsense efficiency of someone who had stopped performing femininity for professional audiences a long time ago. She stood when I entered, shook my hand once firmly, and gestured to the chair across from her desk without preamble. She was already looking at her screen. "Mr. Spencer," she said, without looking up, "before you show me anything you've brought, I need to tell you what I found this morning after our call." Something in her tone reorganized the air in the room. "All right," I said. She turned the monitor to face me. The petition had been filed on the 11th of the previous month. 30 days ago, while I had been sitting in St. Augustine's second pew, while I had been eating reheated soup alone in the kitchen, while Oliver had been arriving unannounced with Thai food and careful questions about my sleep, the petition to have me declared legally incompetent had already been filed in probate court, signed by my son as primary petitioner, co-signed by Arthur in his capacity as my business partner of record. The supporting documentation ran to 47 pages. Valerie walked me through it with the efficiency of someone who had seen this architecture before and found it both familiar and contemptible. Medical observations from Dr. Aris, clinical language describing what he characterized as progressive cognitive deterioration, episodes of confusion, and inability to manage financial decisions. A psychiatric referral, unsigned as yet, but included as a pending attachment. Character statements from two people I recognized as occasional dinner guests of Arthur's, individuals I had met perhaps 4 times combined, who had apparently observed my decline with great concern. And at the center of the financial evidence, the load-bearing document on which the entire structural argument rested, a wire transfer confirmation. International, dated 3 weeks ago. $4,200,000. Transferred from the primary operating account of Spencer Architectural to an offshore holding entity I had never heard of, in a jurisdiction I had never visited, authorized by a signature that my own hand had apparently produced. Valerie slid a printed copy across the desk. I looked at it for a long time. The signature was a perfect forgery of my own, not an approximation, not the lazy reproduction of someone who had seen my name typed and attempted to replicate the letters. This was a studied, practiced copy. The specific pressure variation in the S, the way my pen always lifted slightly before the second stroke of the P, details that a person would only know from having watched me sign documents across a table, repeatedly, over years. Arthur had sat across that table from me for 4 decades. "This is not my signature," I said. My voice came out very level, which surprised me. "I know," Valerie said. "A forensic document examiner will confirm that. But Mr. Spencer, the account is in your name. The authorization carries your signature. And the petition uses this transfer as its primary exhibit, proof that you initiated a massive, irrational financial action with no business justification, consistent with the cognitive deterioration Dr. Aris has been documenting for the past 10 months. 10 months, beginning precisely from the week after Nina's funeral. They built the medical record first," I said, understanding it as I said it. "Aris has been constructing a psychiatric history for 10 months. The transfer gives them the financial proof point. The petition is the mechanism. In that sequence," Valerie confirmed, "it is a very credible case. To a judge who doesn't know you, reviewing documents alone, it is, I will be direct with you, a genuinely persuasive case." "Your son is claiming you have severe dementia," Valerie said, and the sentence arrived with a quality I hadn't anticipated, not shocking, exactly, but vertiginous. Like standing on a roof and understanding, suddenly, that the edge is closer than your last measurement. I said nothing for a moment. I thought about Oliver at the dinner table, unable to hold my gaze for more than 3 seconds. I thought about Fiona's thumb over the prescription warning label. I thought about the transmitter broadcasting jazz to no one in my kitchen, and the ledger in the false bottom of my drafting case, and Nina's voice from that small machine. My heart didn't fail on its own. I thought about my son signing his name to a document that described his father as a man losing his mind. "He is not claiming I have dementia because he believes it," I said. "No," Valerie agreed. "He is claiming it because it is the most efficient legal instrument for transferring control of your assets while you are still alive." She paused, "which is considerably more convenient for them than waiting." The implication of that last sentence required no expansion. They didn't just want my life, I said quietly to the glass and the city spread below it. They wanted to erase my mind first, strip the legal standing, seize the firm, drain the accounts, and by the time anyone looked at what remained, there would be nothing left worth examining. Just an old man with dementia who'd made a series of unfortunate financial decisions before his health gave out. Clean, Valerie said, legally unassailable, and entirely irreversible if we allow it to proceed unchallenged. She pulled the calendar from the corner of her desk and placed it between us. The 15th, she said. 6 days from today, the petition enters its next procedural phase. At that point, the court appoints a guardian ad litem, a legal representative for your interests, selected from an approved list over which you have no input. Once that appointment is made, your independent legal authority to act, to countersign documents, to make decisions about the firm is suspended pending the hearing. And the hearing is scheduled for the 28th. She held my gaze. 13 days after the suspension begins. 13 days during which Arthur and Oliver have full interim access to the firm's operational accounts, pending the court's final determination. I sat back in that chair and looked at the ceiling for a moment, because sometimes the only way to absorb the full geometry of a trap is to stop looking at its individual components and see the whole shape. The whole shape was elegant. I could recognize that, the way an architect can recognize a well-designed building even when it's designed to contain him. Medical record established over 10 months. Financial forgery executed 3 weeks ago. Petition filed a month ago. Time to give it procedural momentum before I could react. Supplements administered daily to ensure that by the time any of this reached a courtroom, my presentation, my physical steadiness, my cognitive clarity, my ability to articulate a coherent counter-narrative might be genuinely compromised. Not dementia, not yet, but something, fogginess, fatigue, the subtle cumulative erosion of a man being slowly, chemically undermined. I stopped taking the supplements 2 days ago, I said. Valerie's expression shifted very slightly. Good. My investigator believes they may be the delivery mechanism for whatever was used on Nina as well. Modified dosage, extended timeline, same basic architecture. She wrote something on her notepad. I want his findings the moment they're available. A pause. And I want an independent psychiatric evaluation scheduled before the end of today. I have a forensic psychiatrist, no connection to any party in this matter, court recognized, whose documentation carries significant procedural weight. She can see you tomorrow morning if I call her in the next hour. Call her. I also need something from you, Mr. Spencer. She set down her pen. I need access to Nina's ledger. Not a copy. You were right to bring originals. The financial records Nina compiled, if they document the embezzlement in the detail you've described, constitute independent evidence of motive that directly contradicts the picture they've painted of you as an incompetent who authorized irrational transfers. She paused. It demonstrates that the money moved because they moved it. Not because you lost your mind. I set the drafting case on her desk and opened the false bottom. She looked at the ledger for a long moment before touching it. Your wife, she said, was a methodical woman. She was the most precise person I ever knew, I said. She could look at a structural drawing and find the load error before the engineer did. She trusted numbers. She trusted sequence. I paused. She trusted them more than she trusted people by the end. Valerie opened the ledger carefully, turned the first 3 pages, and stopped at a section I hadn't yet fully decoded, a column of dates and initials in the far right margin. These initials, she said. She looked up. Arthur. His full name is Arthur Croft. She nodded slowly, looking back at the page. These dates align with the firm's quarterly account reconciliations. She traced a finger down the column without touching the paper. Nina wasn't just documenting the embezzlement. She was documenting who was present when the accounts were accessed. She looked up again. She was building an audit trail. I left Valerie's office at 4:37 with a psychiatric evaluation scheduled for 8 the following morning. A forensic document examiner engaged to authenticate the forged signature by the 13th, and a counterpetition Valerie would file the moment both reports were in her hands. The elevator descended 14 floors in silence. I stood in the lobby for a moment, watching the street through the glass frontage, the late afternoon light cutting low across the pavement, the pedestrian traffic thickening toward rush hour, the ordinary, indifferent momentum of a city at the end of a working day. My phone showed 2 missed calls from Oliver, 1 from Arthur. I had not heard from Arthur since Nina's funeral. He had sent food, flowers, a handwritten note on his firm's letterhead. He had appeared at the memorial and stood beside me and held my arm during the interment with the solicitous attentiveness of a man who knew exactly how much I was suffering, because he had engineered it precisely. He was calling me now because the account freeze had been designed to surface. It was meant to be discovered, meant to appear to me as a confusing, distressing anomaly, something I would call my son about in panic, something that would generate the kind of agitated, disoriented phone call that could later be described in court as consistent with cognitive decline. I put the phone in my pocket without returning either call. Outside, the air was sharp and cold, and the city moved around me without interest, and I walked the 4 blocks to where I'd parked and sat in the driver's seat without starting the engine for a moment, running the sequence again from the beginning. The medical record, the supplements, the forgery, the petition, the frozen accounts, the calls I wasn't returning designed to provoke a reaction I wasn't going to give them. I checked the glove compartment for the notepad I kept there, a habit from drafting, always a surface to think on, and wrote 1 line at the top of a clean page. The signature was a perfect forgery of my own. Beneath it, 1 question. Who else has been watching me sign my name? I had the answer before I finished writing the question. Dr. Aris had been present at 3 account reviews in the past 8 months, invited by Oliver as a courtesy, positioned as a family physician getting familiar with the estate structure. A physician in a financial meeting at Oliver's invitation. I started the car. Gideon needed to know tonight. The call came at 2:09 in the morning. I was not asleep. I had not been asleep. I'd been sitting at the kitchen table with the ledger open to the section Valerie had flagged, the column of dates and Arthur's initials, cross-referencing each entry against the firm's quarterly calendar I'd retrieved from my personal files. A physical copy, paper, nothing digital, because I was no longer using any device connected to my home network for anything that mattered. The burner phone Gideon had handed me at the end of our first meeting, a detail he'd mentioned so casually I'd almost missed its implication, vibrated against the table once, then again. I picked it up before the 3rd vibration. "You need to be awake for this," he said, without greeting. "I am." A pause in which I heard him decide something. "I'm going to send you a file, 17 pages. Read it while we talk." Her name was not Fiona Spencer. It had not been Fiona anything originally. Gideon had started where investigative work always starts, not with the person, but with the edges of the person, the administrative residue that accumulates around any life lived in proximity to money. Marriage certificates, property transfers, probate filings, insurance disbursements. The bureaucratic skeleton of a life, which is considerably harder to falsify completely than the life itself. She surfaced first in Georgia, Gideon said, his voice carrying the particular flatness of a man who has been reading devastating material for several hours and has processed through the emotional register into something more functional. 7 years ago. Different name, I'll spare you the pronunciation, it's in the file. Engaged to a 63-year-old retired developer. Substantial property holdings, no children, One estranged sibling who contested nothing because the will was airtight and the lawyer was excellent. The developer died 14 months after the engagement. Cardiac event, ruled natural. He had a documented heart condition, had notably, since a medical examination approximately 4 months into the relationship, recommended a cardiology specialist. A pause. The specialist was not local. He'd driven 2 hours for the referral. I looked at the file on my screen. The photograph Gideon had sourced was slightly grainy, a social media image since deleted, but the bone structure was unmistakable. The posture, the specific, composed quality of a woman who is always performing something. "That's Fiona," I said. Different hair, different name, same geometry. Gideon turned a page on his end. The estate settled at approximately $2.8 million. She was the sole beneficiary. The estranged sibling filed an initial objection that was withdrawn 6 weeks later. I'm still working on why it was withdrawn. My instinct is financial, but I don't have the documentation yet. The second one. Colorado, 4 years ago. Retired surgeon, 67, widower, 1 adult daughter who lived out of state and visited twice a year. He paused. The daughter is the reason I found this. She never accepted the ruling. She's been maintaining a personal record for 4 years, not with any law enforcement body because no one would take it seriously, but with herself. Kept every document. I spoke to her at 11 o'clock tonight. The file page I was on showed a probate record. The name at the top was different again, but the beneficiary designation was a woman described in the accompanying document as the deceased's fiancée of 14 months. 14 months, the same duration. Gideon. I know. Both engagements were 14 months. Both preceded by a medical examination that identified a cardiac vulnerability. His voice remained level. Both followed by specialist referrals to physicians outside the immediate area. Both resulting in cardiac events ruled natural. Both estates settled within 8 months of death, minimal contest, maximum disbursement. I stood up from the table because I needed to be standing. Fiona isn't her real name, Gideon said. And whatever name she's currently using, she has done this before with a precision that suggests it is not improvisation. This is methodology. Refined, iterated, improved across at least 2 prior executions that I can document, and I want to be careful with that qualifier, because careful is what will make this usable. How much did the Colorado estate settle for? $4.1 million, a beat. She has collected, conservatively, $7 million from 2 men who are dead. She is now married to your son, who stands to inherit a firm and a personal estate worth. What did Valerie estimate? Conservatively, $18 million. The silence on the line had a specific weight. 2 dead men, I said. 2 massive payouts. I looked at the photograph on the file page again, that deleted social media image, the precise posture, the performance of warmth behind which something entirely cold had been operating for years. She graduated from engagements to marriage. Higher commitment, Gideon said, higher return, and considerably more legal complexity if anything goes wrong, which is probably why she needed Arthur. She needed someone with the financial architecture and the legal connections to make the competency petition viable. Doing this alone, she could take Oliver. With Arthur's infrastructure, she can take everything. I moved to the window. The street below was empty, the amber wash of the streetlight on wet pavement, and I stood there with the phone against my ear and thought about my son. Oliver checking his phone constantly. Oliver, who had not held my gaze across the dinner table. Oliver, who had signed his name to a petition describing his father as a man losing his mind. I need to ask you something, I said. Go ahead. In your assessment, professional, not speculative, is Oliver a knowing participant in what Fiona has done before? Or is he? That, Gideon said, is the most important question in this entire case, and I want to answer it correctly rather than quickly. I heard him move, the creak of a chair. Here is what I can tell you from the documentation. Oliver's gambling debts predate his marriage to Fiona by approximately 8 months. The offshore account Arthur paid down your money, routed through the firm, which Nina documented. That payment was made 6 weeks after Oliver and Fiona became engaged. Arthur paid Oliver's debts 6 weeks into the engagement, which means Arthur knew about Fiona or knew of her before the marriage, before most people in Oliver's life would have had any reason to investigate a new girlfriend. A pause. That is not coincidence, Mr. Spencer. Arthur did not stumble onto Fiona's history by accident. I believe he found her or was found by her, and that what appeared to be your son falling in love was, at its origin point, a recruitment. The word landed with a particular ugliness. Oliver was recruited. As access, Gideon said quietly, as the mechanism through which Fiona could enter your life with a legitimate familial relationship, and as a liability, because a man with $2 million of debt held by the person orchestrating the conspiracy against him is a man who will sign whatever he's told to sign and say whatever he's told to say. Was Oliver a mastermind or just her next victim? I said it half to myself, looking at the street. He may not have known what she did before. He may have known about Arthur's plan and agreed to it out of terror, without knowing the full, without knowing what she is. Possible, Gideon said. Also possible he knows everything and has made a calculated choice. I can't determine intent from documentation, but I'll tell you this, the daughter in Colorado, the surgeon's daughter who kept 4 years of records because no one would listen. He paused. She wants to testify. She wants to be in a room where someone is finally listening. Get her a number for Valerie, I said, tonight. We talked for another 40 minutes. Gideon walked me through the alias trail, 3 names across 7 years, each one a clean identity with fabricated professional history. Each one retired the moment an estate was settled and a new geography began. The transitions were smooth, unhurried, the work of someone who had learned from the previous iteration. The woman currently living in my son's house, eating at my table, placing supplement bottles in my kitchen cabinet with her thumb over the warning label. She was the 3rd version of a methodology that had already killed 2 men. And she was sleeping 6 miles from where I was standing. One more thing, Gideon said, as the call was ending. Toxicology came back an hour ago. I didn't want to lead with it because I needed you focused for the Fiona material, but you should know. I waited. The supplements contain a cardiac glycoside compound, synthetic, not naturally derived, which is why a standard tox screen wouldn't catch it. At the dosage in those capsules, taken daily over several months, it would produce progressive cardiac strain, fatigue, arrhythmia, increasing vulnerability to an acute event. His voice was careful and even. The compound is consistent with what would have caused Nina's death if administered in a higher concentration over a shorter period. The kitchen was very quiet. It's the same mechanism, I said. Modified timeline, lower intensity. You were being prepared, not executed, not yet. They needed you functional enough to sign documents, appear at meetings, be seen by the court-appointed examiner as a man in decline rather than a man in crisis. A pause. They wanted you diminished, manageable, legally erasable. And then, once the legal transfer was complete and the firm was secured, yes. I looked at the supplement bottle on the counter. Still there, still positioned for the transmitter's benefit, still containing what Gideon's toxicologist had now confirmed in writing. The pills weren't vitamins. Standing in that kitchen at 2 in the morning with Gideon's report in one hand and 7 years of Fiona's history in a file on my table, it arrived with a finality that went beyond anger, beyond even grief. They were a slow execution, and Nina had found out, and so they accelerated hers. I'll have the full written report to Valerie by 6 a.m., Gideon said. Get some sleep if you can. I didn't sleep. I sat at the table until the sky outside began its gradual negotiation from black to gray, and I read the 17 pages twice more, and I thought about the shape of what I was dealing with, not the individual elements now, but the complete structure. Arthur, with 40 years of envy and architectural precision, who had built this plan the way I build buildings, from the foundation up, with nothing left to chance. Fiona, with 7 years of lethal methodology, and the specific talent of making dangerous things look like love. Oliver, somewhere in the space between culprit and casualty, drowning in a debt that had made him somebody else's instrument. Dr. Aris, who had been constructing a medical record for 10 months, and who had watched me sign my name in 3 separate financial meetings. And me, 60 years old, silver-haired, calloused hands, a firm with my name on the door and a deadline in 4 days, and a son I still, despite every document on this table, could not entirely stop loving. That last fact was the most dangerous thing about my position. I knew it. I sat with it in the gray pre-dawn and made myself look at it directly, the way I look at a structural flaw in a drawing before I correct it, not with sentiment, with clarity. Because the plan forming in the back of my mind, the one that had been assembling itself in the margins of every conversation with Gideon and every page of Valerie's filings, depended entirely on Oliver being the weak point. And the weak point only breaks under the right kind of pressure. I pulled the notepad toward me and wrote one name at the top of a clean page. Then I wrote 2 words beneath it. The cabin. Valerie filed the counterpetition on the 14th. 1 day before the deadline, with the forensic document examiner's report attached, the independent psychiatric evaluation attached, and Gideon's toxicology findings attached, 3 documents that, taken together, reframed the entire legal narrative from a family protecting a declining patriarch to a coordinated conspiracy using medicine and forgery as instruments of financial predation. She called me at 4 in the afternoon to confirm the filing. "It's in," she said. "The competency petition is now contested. The guardian ad litem appointment is stayed pending the hearing. You have your legal standing intact, Mr. Spencer, for now." For now, I repeated. The hearing is still the 28th. Between now and then, they will recalibrate. They know the petition has been challenged. They don't yet know what evidence we have, but they know something shifted. She was right. I'd seen it in Oliver's texts. The register had changed subtly, from the performed warmth of welfare checks to something with a slightly different frequency. More frequent contact, shorter messages, the behavioral pattern of a person monitoring a situation that has become unpredictable. Arthur's response came differently. An invitation, handwritten, delivered by courier to my front door. "Max, it has been too long since we sat together properly. Come for dinner Saturday, just the 4 of us. I've been saving something from the cellar I think you'll appreciate. A." The handwriting was impeccable. The warmth was total. The timing was the most terrifying thing I had read all week. Gideon held the invitation by its edges and read it twice. "He knows the petition was challenged," he said. "He knows something moved. He doesn't know what or how much. And rather than withdraw, he's pulling you closer." Gideon set the card on his desk. "That tells you something important about how he's constructed this in his own mind. He still believes he controls the variables. He believes proximity is an advantage, that having you at his table in his space allows him to assess exactly how much you know." He looked at me. He's also not ruling out the possibility that Saturday is the last dinner he needs to host. The sentence was stated without drama, which made it considerably more effective than drama would have been. "I'm going," I said. I know. He was already opening the lower drawer of his desk, which is why I had this prepared 2 days ago. The wire was smaller than I'd imagined. A transmitter the diameter of a shirt button, with an adhesive backing and a battery life of 14 hours, paired with a receiver Gideon would monitor from a vehicle parked on the road outside Arthur's estate. The audio quality, he assured me, was sufficient for evidentiary purposes if anything usable was said, though he was careful to frame that qualifier. "I need you to understand something clearly," he said, while showing me the placement left side of the chest below the collarbone under a layer of fabric. "A wire gets you captured audio. It does not get you a confession unless someone chooses to confess. Your job Saturday is not to extract. Your job is to observe, to survive, and to give me material to work with." He met my eyes. "Do not push. Do not probe in ways that register as probing. You are a grieving man having dinner with old friends." "I've been performing that role for 11 months, I said. "Then Saturday is the final dress rehearsal." He handed me the device. I held it in my palm, this small, matte thing that would carry every word spoken in Arthur's dining room to a receiver in Gideon's car, and I thought about the last time I had sat at that table. A birthday, Nina's, 4 years ago. Arthur had made a toast, and I had thought, watching him, that there was something almost paternal in the way he looked at her. I had found it touching. I looked at the wire in my palm. "What time do you want me in position?" Gideon said. "Dinner is at 7. Be there by 6:30. Arthur's estate sat at the end of a private drive lined with mature oaks that had been there longer than either of us. The house itself was Georgian, immaculate, maintained with the kind of obsessive precision that reflects not a love of the house but a love of the image the house projects. I had always understood this about Arthur's relationship to his possessions. They were arguments, every one of them. Evidence in a case he had been building his entire life about who he was and what he deserved. I rang the bell at 7 exactly. He answered it himself, which he always did when he wanted to control the first impression. Three-piece suit, charcoal with a faint chalk stripe. The silver-headed cane he'd adopted 2 years ago after a knee procedure carried more as punctuation than support, I'd always thought. His smile arrived first and spread with the practiced ease of a man who had smiled on command for so long it no longer required conscious execution. "Max," he gripped my arm with his free hand, the shoulder grip warm and firm, the particular gesture of a man claiming physical proximity as emotional evidence. "Come in, come in." The same grip, I noted, entering the hallway. The exact pressure, the exact placement. Arthur squeezed my shoulder in comfort the same way he had done on the day Nina died. I had thought it was grief that day, shared grief sincere and human. I smiled at him and handed him the bottle of wine I'd brought and followed him into the house. Oliver and Fiona were already there, Oliver in the sitting room, standing near the window with a glass he was holding but not drinking from, the posture of a man who needs something in his hands. Fiona on the sofa, composed as architecture, her attention moving to me the moment I entered with a smile calibrated to suggest she'd been looking forward to this. "Max," she rose, embraced me. "Practice pressure, precise duration." I held the performance together with the concentration of a man crossing a frozen lake, one deliberate step at a time, testing the surface before committing weight. Oliver looked at me for 2 seconds, then at the floor. A faint muscle in his jaw was working. He was not well. Whatever he was telling himself to sustain his participation in this arrangement was costing him in ways that were becoming visible. "You look better," he said, which meant he'd expected me to look worse. "Good air," I said. "I've been walking mornings." Arthur appeared from the hallway carrying a bottle with both hands, the reverent two-handed carrying of a man presenting something ceremonial. The label was old. I could see that from across the room, and his expression was the expression of a host about to deliver the evening's defining moment. 1989, he said, setting it on the sideboard with careful ceremony. "Bordeaux. I've been saving this for something genuinely worth celebrating, and I decided, Max, what better occasion than the 4 of us together, properly together, like the old days." He looked at me as he said "like the old days," and his eyes were warm and still and entirely empty. "To long life," Arthur toasted, his eyes dead. I watched him pour. He poured mine first, the host's gesture, the guest of honor's portion, with the unhurried attention of a man who understands the weight of ritual. The wine was a deep garnet, and it moved in the glass with the particular viscosity of something old and dense and carefully kept. He handed it to me. I brought it to within an inch of my lips. I did not drink. The conversation moved the way dinners at Arthur's always moved. His orchestration, his tempo, pulling each participant into the rhythm he set. He talked about the firm, about an exhibition of architectural work from the firm's early years that someone had apparently proposed, about a property in the hills he was considering. He asked about my health with the fluency of a man who already knew the answer he wanted to hear. Oliver contributed minimally. Fiona contributed precisely, the right observation at the right interval, always pulling the room slightly toward whatever topic served the evening subtext. I watched all of it from behind the performance of a man having a pleasant dinner. My wine glass went to my lips 4 times over the course of the meal. I did not drink from it once. It is a skill, the convincing almost sip, the glass lowered with the body language of satisfaction, the appropriate comment about the vintage's depth. I had attended enough client dinners over 40 years, enough meetings where I needed to appear more relaxed than I was to manage the choreography. At a certain point, Arthur said, with the ease of a man who has prepared the sentence, "You know, Max, it would ease everyone's mind if you considered a more formal arrangement for the firm, just administratively, just to ensure continuity in case." He spread his hand expressively. "Life is uncertain." He wasn't looking at my face when he said it. He was looking at my wine glass. Checking, I understood, checking how much I'd had, calibrating what he expected my resistance to be. "Let me think about it," I said. He smiled, "Of course, no pressure, just we all want what's best, for the firm, for you." Across the table, Oliver's jaw tightened imperceptibly. After dinner, Arthur moved the gathering to the garden terrace, a broad limestone expanse overlooking a sloped lawn, lit with the amber warmth of installed terrace lighting. The October air was sharp. Someone had lit the outdoor heaters. I carried my wine glass. They were in conversation behind me, Arthur and Fiona, something low and almost social, the performance of an evening winding down pleasantly. Oliver had gone to the bathroom. I stood at the stone balustrade at the garden's edge, looking out at the dark lawn below. I let the red wine soak into the soil when they looked away. A slow, unhurried pour along the inside edge of the balustrade, the wine disappearing into the dark earth of the garden bed below, silent and complete. I straightened, the empty glass in my hand, and turned back to the terrace with the easy bearing of a man who had enjoyed the last of an exceptional vintage. Arthur, watching from across the terrace, looked satisfied. I stayed another 40 minutes, said my goodbyes with the warmth of a man who has had a good evening among old friends. Arthur gripped my arm again at the door, that shoulder grip, that same pressure. "Good to have you back, Max," he said. "It was long overdue," I said. I meant something entirely different by it. Gideon was parked where he'd said he'd be, lights off, engine running. I got in the passenger side without looking toward the house. "Clean exit," he said. Audio was clear throughout. The comment about the firm's administrative arrangement is useful, not confessional, but it establishes intent in context. He was already running the recording back on a small monitor. "Did you drink anything?" "Nothing." "Good." He glanced at me. "The wine?" "In the garden bed below the terrace." He nodded, made a note. We drove in silence for several minutes. My phone vibrated. A message from Oliver. "Good to see you tonight, Dad, really." I looked at it for a moment and put the phone away. At 6:40 the following morning, Gideon called. His voice was very quiet and very precise, the register he used when delivering information that required careful handling. "I went back to check the garden this morning," he said, "before Arthur's groundsman arrived. And there was a dog, Stray, from the look of it, had come in through the side gate overnight. A pause. It was in the garden bed below the terrace max. I gripped the phone. The dog didn't wake up the next morning, Gideon said. The line was silent. I need you to call Valerie, he said, right now, before you do anything else. I wore the tweed. Not for sentiment, for precision, because a man who shows up to his own competency hearing in the clothes of someone who has stopped caring about appearance has already conceded something. I chose the jacket Nina had always called the serious one, the charcoal herringbone with the structured shoulders, and I sat in front of the mirror at 6 in the morning and looked at myself with the evaluative remove of an architect reviewing a completed elevation drawing. Silver-haired, sharp-featured, hands calloused from 40 years of drafting folded now in my lap, a man who looked exactly like what he was. I drove to the courthouse alone, which Valerie had advised against and which I had decided was necessary. Not out of stubbornness, out of optics. A man who arrives at his own competency hearing accompanied is a man who has already accepted the premise that he needs accompanying. I parked, walked the 4 blocks, and entered through the main public entrance rather than the side door Valerie had suggested, because the side door was the door of a man managing his visibility. I had nothing to manage. Valerie was waiting in the corridor outside courtroom 4 with 2 associates, and a document case that I had learned over the past 2 weeks contained considerably more firepower than its exterior suggested. She looked at me once, assessed the tweed, and gave a single brief nod. They're already inside, she said, all of them. Arthur sat in the gallery's first row. He had dressed, as always, with the precision of a closing argument, a dark 3-piece, the silver-headed cane resting against the bench beside him. He looked like a man attending a proceeding in which he had significant interest but no formal role, which was accurate in the narrowest technical sense, and entirely false in every sense that mattered. When I entered, he caught my eye and produced the smile. That warm, practiced arrival of an expression that stopped reliably short of his eyes. I held his gaze for 3 seconds, then looked away, because acknowledging him with anything longer was a gift I had no intention of giving. Oliver sat at the petitioner's table with the family's retained attorney, a compact, precise man named Garrett who had the confident bearing of someone unaccustomed to losing procedural arguments. Oliver was in a dark suit that fit him poorly, the fabric slightly wrong across the shoulders, the collar of his shirt bearing the faint impression of a man who had knotted and re-knotted his tie that morning. He looked at me once when I entered. Watching my son swear on a Bible to destroy me, I had imagined this moment many times in the preceding days. I had imagined anger or grief or the particular cold clarity of betrayal fully confirmed. What I actually felt, looking at Oliver across that courtroom, was something more difficult and less useful. I saw the 16-year-old who had been afraid of his own ambition, the young man who had never quite believed the things I'd built were something he could be part of rather than overshadowed by. I saw the architecture of a failure that had 2 builders. I looked away and sat down beside Valerie. Ready, she said, not as a question. For weeks, I said. The judge was a woman in her early 60s named the Honorable Patricia Wren, whose reputation Valerie had described in 3 words during our preparation: methodical, impatient, fair. She entered without ceremony, situated herself at the bench, and looked at the room over the top of her glasses with the expression of someone who had seen every variant of human behavior that courtrooms produce, and had long since stopped being surprised by any of it. We're here on the petition filed by Oliver Spencer requesting a determination of legal incapacity regarding Maxwell Spencer, she said, consulting her documents. I've reviewed the preliminary filings. Counsel for the petitioner may proceed. Garrett opened with the structure they'd built. He was good. I could acknowledge that dispassionately, the way I can acknowledge a well-engineered building I find aesthetically contemptible. He moved through the evidence in a logical sequence. Dr. Aris's medical observations, the financial transfer, the characterizations from Arthur's dinner guests, the pattern of what he described as erratic decision-making. He spoke with the measured confidence of a man presenting an airtight case to a judge who would simply need to execute the obvious conclusion. Then he called Dr. Aris. He was younger than I'd expected from someone who had been constructing a 10-month medical fraud, mid-40s, trim, with the particular professional composure of a man who has testified before and found the experience manageable. He settled into the witness chair with a slight adjustment of his jacket and looked at Garrett with the cooperative attentiveness of a credible expert. Garrett walked him through the medical record chronologically, each entry narrated with clinical fluency, the observed confusion, the documented episodes, the progressive deterioration consistent with early-stage dementia, the recommendation for supervised financial management that had, in Dr. Aris's professional judgment, become urgent. Dr. Aris smiled throughout, the contained, collegial smile of a man presenting evidence he found professionally straightforward. It was the most polished perjury I had ever witnessed. Valerie made 2 notes during his direct examination. She did not object once. When Garrett finished, she stood. She approached the witness stand without the document she'd been writing on, without any visible material at all, just herself, and the particular quality of attention she directed at Dr. Aris that I had first noticed in her office and had since come to understand as her most effective instrument. "Dr. Aris," she said, "you've been Mr. Spencer's cardiologist for approximately 10 months. That's correct. And during those 10 months, you conducted how many in-person examinations?" A slight pause, 4 comprehensive examinations and several follow-up consultations. 4. She let the number exist in the room for a moment. In 10 months of documented progressive cognitive decline, you conducted 4 examinations. The nature of the condition doesn't always require. I'll move on. She produced a single document from the table behind her without looking away from him. You prescribed a supplement regimen for Mr. Spencer approximately 9 months ago. Is that correct? A cardiac support supplement, yes. Standard protocol for. Are you familiar with synthetic cardiac glycoside compounds? The pause this time was different in quality, fractionally longer, in a general sense. In a general sense. Valerie turned to the judge. "Your Honor, I'd like to enter into evidence the findings of a toxicological analysis conducted on supplements prescribed by Dr. Aris to Mr. Spencer, performed by Dr. Renata Voss, a board-certified forensic toxicologist whose credentials I've included in the exhibit." Garrett was on his feet. The objection was procedural, and Valerie had anticipated every procedural angle. The exhibit had been properly disclosed, properly authenticated, properly filed. Judge Wren looked at Garrett with the mild impatience Valerie had predicted and overruled him before he finished the sentence. The exhibit was entered. Valerie turned back to Dr. Aris. "The analysis found synthetic cardiac glycoside compounds in the supplements you prescribed. At the dosage contained in those capsules, taken daily over a period of months, the cumulative effect on cardiac function would be," she consulted the exhibit, "significant arrhythmic stress, progressive fatigue, and markedly elevated vulnerability to acute cardiac events." She looked up. "Is that consistent with your medical knowledge?" The composure was still there, but it was working harder. "Supplements can interact with." "Is it consistent with your medical knowledge, Dr. Aris? Yes or no?" Yes, in theory." "In theory." She set the exhibit down. "One more question. You attended 3 financial review meetings at Spencer Architectural over the past 8 months at the invitation of Oliver Spencer. Is that correct?" "I attended in a support capacity." "Is that correct?" "Yes." "Thank you." She turned away. No further questions. Oliver was called 40 minutes later. He walked to the witness stand with the careful tread of a man navigating ground he knows is unstable, and he placed his hand on the Bible with an expression I recognized from his childhood. The specific look he wore when he was about to tell me something that was partially true, and hoping the partial truth would be enough. He was sworn in. Garrett's direct examination of Oliver was built on the personal, the concerned son, the witnessed episodes, the dinner conversations where his father had seemed confused, had repeated himself, had made statements that didn't cohere. Oliver delivered it with a practiced sadness that would have been convincing to anyone who didn't know that his jaw tightened when he was performing an emotion rather than experiencing it. I watched his jaw throughout. It tightened on every significant claim. Watching my son swear on a Bible to destroy me, the sentence I'd been carrying for days, I finally understood, sitting in that courtroom, that the destroying had begun long before this moment. That what Oliver was doing on that stand was not the act that had damaged us. The damage had accumulated differently, across years, in smaller choices that had each seemed individually survivable until collectively they had produced a man capable of this. Valerie's cross-examination of Oliver was not aggressive. It was worse than aggressive, it was methodical. She established, through a careful sequence of financial documents, that Oliver had direct access to the firm's offshore transfer architecture. That the transfer, which the petition had characterized as Max's irrational action, had been executed from a terminal to which Oliver had exclusive credentials. That Oliver had been present at Arthur's estate on the evening before the transfer was filed, a fact established by a security entrance log from Arthur's private road that Gideon had obtained through means I'd chosen not to fully examine. She did not accuse. She simply laid each document beside the previous one, like an architect placing structural elements, until the building was visible to anyone in the room with functioning eyes. Oliver's answers became shorter, then monosyllabic. Then he stopped looking at Garrett and started looking at the table in front of him. My son couldn't look at me as he stepped down from the stand. I noticed this. I filed it somewhere I would examine later when there was space for what it meant. Valerie's final exhibit was Dr. Miriam Osai, the independent forensic psychiatrist, court recognized, whose evaluation of me had been conducted over 2 full sessions with no prior relationship to any party in the matter. Dr. Os took the stand with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had done this many times and found courtroom theater considerably less interesting than clinical accuracy. She described the evaluation process. She described her findings. She used precise, technical language that Valerie had arranged, I suspected, specifically because precise technical language is very difficult to attack without equivalent credentials. And Garrett, cross-examining, did not have equivalent credentials. Dr. Osai's conclusion, stated without qualification, was that Maxwell Spencer demonstrated no clinical indicators of cognitive decline, dementia, or any condition affecting legal decision-making capacity. His presentation was consistent with a man under significant sustained stress, who was responding to that stress with above-average analytical acuity. Above-average analytical acuity. I kept my expression neutral and looked at my hands on the table. In the gallery's first row, Arthur had gone very still. Valerie's closing was 4 minutes long. She did not raise her voice once. She presented the counter-narrative in the same sequence she'd built it: the forged signature, the poisoned supplements, the compromised physician, the financially conflicted petitioner, and she described it not as a family dispute or a contested medical opinion, but as what the evidence had established it to be: a coordinated attempt to use legal process as an instrument of financial predation against a man whose only demonstrable error had been trusting the people he loved. Judge Wren listened without expression. When Valerie sat down, the judge looked at the petitioner's table for a long moment. Then she looked at her documents. Then she removed her glasses and set them on the bench in the manner of someone who has made a decision and is now simply organizing the language for it. The medical testimony presented by the petitioner has been materially undermined by the toxicological evidence and the independent psychiatric evaluation. Her voice carried the flat, procedural authority of someone accustomed to rooms that go quiet when they speak. The financial evidence central to the petition has significant authentication, concerns that counsel for petitioner has not adequately addressed. A pause. This court finds the petition insufficient to meet the evidentiary standard required for a declaration of legal incapacity. She picked up the gavel. Petition denied. The sound of it in that room was very clean. The war had just begun. I understood this even as I shook Valerie's hand, even as I gathered my documents and stood and felt, for the first time in weeks, the specific relief of a man who has stopped a particular blade. I understood it because I looked at Arthur as I turned toward the exit, and his expression was not the expression of a man who has lost. It was the expression of a man who has revised his timeline. The warmth was gone, not replaced by anger, which would have been readable, but by something quieter and more dangerous. Calculation, restarted from the current position. The mental architecture of a person who has been building towards something for 40 years and is not deterred by a procedural setback. He held my gaze across the courtroom. I held it back. Then I walked out through the main entrance, the same way I'd entered, into the cold morning light, and I called Gideon from the courthouse steps. "It's done," I said. "The petition was dismissed." I know I was listening. A pause. "Max, Arthur left through the side exit 4 minutes ago. He made one phone call before he reached his car. 43 seconds. "Who did he call?" "Fiona," Gideon said. "Not Oliver, Fiona." I stood on the courthouse steps and absorbed the specific meaning of that sequence. That in the moment of defeat, Arthur had not called his legal co-conspirator. He had called the one member of this arrangement with a demonstrable history of resolving problems that other methods had failed to solve. "All right," I said. "The cabin," Gideon said. "The cabin," I confirmed. "Start wiring it." Gideon found the second bug on a Thursday. Not in a clock this time, in the smoke detector above the kitchen table, which had been there so long I'd stopped seeing it the way you stop seeing furniture. A different transmitter, different manufacturer, same function, streaming everything that happened at that table to the same destination as the first. Which meant they had audio from the kitchen for however long the device had been installed, and I had no way of knowing exactly when it had gone in. Oliver had replaced the smoke detector batteries 8 months ago. I remembered now, the small ladder, the brief domestic competence of it, the way I'd thanked him, and I felt the retrospective cold of understanding that the batteries had not been the point. Gideon disabled it without removing it, left it in place, operational, the way we'd handled the first one. Let it continue broadcasting the unremarkable sounds of a man living quietly. "There may be others," he said, "in rooms we haven't checked. Or in rooms they don't think I use." "Exactly." He looked at the ceiling of my study. "I'd like to sweep the entire property before the weekend. You'll have access Friday morning." He looked at me. "You've decided." I decided the moment I walked out of that courtroom. The invitation went out by phone, not text, not email, voice calls to each of them individually, because voice is harder to screenshot and easier to misremember. I called Oliver first, which was deliberate. He was the weakest point structurally, and I wanted my voice in his ear before Arthur had the chance to frame the call. "Oliver," I let a silence sit for a moment before continuing, the silence of a man choosing words carefully for emotional rather than strategic reasons. "I've been thinking about the hearing, about how we got to a place where I don't want to talk about fault. I want to talk about whether we can come back from it." A long pause on his end, the sound of him recalibrating. "Dad, I have the cabin booked for the weekend of the 25th. I'd like you and Fiona to come, Arthur as well, just the people who matter." Another pause, calibrated. I'm not interested in the legal situation anymore. I'm interested in whether I still have a family. The silence that followed was the silence of a man deciding whether to be relieved or suspicious, and the deciding itself told me something useful. That Oliver wanted very badly to be relieved, which meant the toll of the past months was considerable, which meant the pressure I planned to apply at the cabin had somewhere to go. "I'll talk to Fiona," he said finally. "Of course," I said. "Let me know by Wednesday." I called Arthur last. He answered on the first ring, which meant he'd been expecting the call, which meant Oliver had already spoken to him in the minutes between my two calls. The network was responsive. I filed this. "Max." His voice was the dinner party version, warm, unhurried, the register of a man who has just been given information he considers favorable. "I was hoping you'd call." "I imagine you were." I kept my own voice easy. "The cabin, Arthur, the 25th. I'd like to put this behind us." "Let's put the past behind us," I said, and every word of it was a lie so complete it almost had its own architecture, load-bearing walls, a solid foundation, nothing that would collapse under casual inspection. "I wouldn't miss it," Arthur said. His warmth was total. His satisfaction was audible beneath it if you knew where to listen. "Wonderful," I said. "I'll have everything ready." I meant something entirely different by it. The cabin sat at the end of 11 miles of unpaved road in the mountains 2 hours north of the city, a property I designed and built myself in the early years of the firm, when I still needed to prove to myself that I could make something with my hands rather than just my drafting pen. Timber frame, stone foundation, 3 bedrooms, a large central room with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over a valley that turned amber in autumn and white in winter. Nina had loved it unreservedly. She'd painted there every summer for 30 years, the canvases accumulating in the storage room off the main hall, stacked in the particular ordered chaos of someone who cares deeply about the work and not at all about the inventory. The cabin was miles from reliable cell service. I knew this the way I knew the property's every structural detail, intimately, completely. A perfect place for a reconciliation weekend. A perfect place for a murder. The distinction, I had come to understand, depended entirely on who arrived better prepared. I drove up on Thursday to meet Gideon, who had been there since Tuesday. He had worked with the thoroughness of a man who understood that the quality of the recording was the difference between evidence and anecdote. I walked through each room while he explained the placement, not hurriedly, not with the breathless precision of improvisation, but with the settled competence of someone who had designed surveillance architectures before and knew where human behavior concentrates. The main room, 2 cameras, positioned in opposing corners at ceiling height, covering every seated position and the area in front of the fireplace where conversations tend to migrate after dinner. Audio receivers in the exposed ceiling beams, the timber framing that gave the room its character also, as it turned out, gave excellent cover for small cylindrical microphones. The kitchen, 1 camera above the refrigerator, angled to cover the preparation area and the table, audio in the pendant light above the island. The hallway connecting the bedrooms, a single wide-angle camera positioned inside what appeared to be a wall-mounted thermometer, a detail I'd sourced specifically, because it matched the cabin's existing aesthetic with the fidelity of something that had always been there. Outside, 2 cameras under the eaves, covering both vehicle approaches and the path to the tree line. Gideon showed me the receiver setup in the storage room off the main hall, Nina's painting room, still stacked with her canvases, which I had chosen deliberately as the monitoring location, because no one else would have a reason to open that door. A laptop, hardwired to the camera system, with a local recording drive that would capture everything regardless of network availability. "No cloud," he said. "No external transmission. Everything stays on the drive until we walk it out of here. Chain of custody. Unimpeachable." He closed the storage room door. Valerie's contact at the prosecutor's office has confirmed they'll receive the recordings. They want clean audio and continuous timestamp verification. They'll have both. Gideon looked at me for a moment with the evaluative attention I'd come to recognize as his version of concern. I want to go over the psychological sequencing again. Who you approach first, in what order, with what material. Oliver, I said, always Oliver first. He's the entry point. And if Arthur intervenes before Oliver breaks? Arthur won't intervene. Arthur has spent 40 years presenting himself as the reasonable one. He'll wait for Oliver to exhaust himself before he moves. I looked at the main room, the fireplace, the long timber table, the windows and the valley beyond them. That patience is the thing I'm counting on. And Fiona. Fiona will watch and calculate and wait for whichever outcome serves her most. She won't break. She doesn't have Oliver's guilt or Arthur's ego, but she doesn't need to break. I paused. She needs to be present when Arthur does. Gideon was quiet for a moment. You've been building this for weeks. I've been building things my entire life, I said. This is the first one I've built to come down. I spent Friday preparing the dossiers. 3 of them, one for Oliver, one for Arthur, one that combined Fiona's alias history with the toxicology findings and the dead dog in Arthur's garden, printed on paper, organized in plain manila folders, because physical documents in a room with no cell service have a weight that a screen cannot replicate. You cannot minimize a printed page. You cannot swipe away from it. It sits on the table in front of you, and it does not move until you make a decision about it. Oliver's folder, the embezzlement documentation from Nina's ledger, the offshore transfer records, the forensic analysis of the forged signature, the evidence that he had robbed his father and then signed his name to a document calling his father incompetent. All of it sourced, authenticated, admissible. Arthur's folder, the 40-year financial record of a partnership in which Arthur had systematically positioned himself to inherit the firm in the event of Max's death or incapacity, beginning long before Nina's illness. The security log placing him at his estate with Oliver the night before the forged transfer. Gideon's audio from the dinner party, Arthur's voice, captured cleanly, discussing the firm's administrative structure in terms that presumed a transfer of control. And one final item in a sealed envelope within the folder which I would open only if everything else failed, Nina's ledger entry, the date, the 3 words. He was there. Fiona's folder, the Georgia probate records, the Colorado probate records, the forensic toxicologist's report, the photograph Gideon had sourced from the deleted social media account, the testimony of the surgeon's daughter, written and signed, describing 14 months of methodical preparation that ended her father's life. The dog's necropsy, Gideon had arranged it quietly, the results confirming cardiac glycoside poisoning consistent with the compound found in my supplements. 2 dead men, 2 massive payouts, 1 methodology refined and redeployed in my son's marriage. I stacked the folders on the cabin's central table Friday evening and looked at them in the firelight. Outside, the valley was dark, and the road in was 11 miles of unpaved distance from anyone who might intervene in whatever happened here this weekend. I was walking into the lion's den. I had understood this from the moment I made the invitation calls, had sat with it through every preparation and every conversation with Gideon, and every document I had organized and authenticated and placed in those folders. The danger was real, and I had not minimized it. Arthur had already killed once that I could prove and once that I couldn't, had poisoned wine that killed a dog, had built a 10-month architecture designed to erase me first legally and then physically. But I had brought the cage. Every camera, every microphone, every authenticated document, the storage room with Gideon's laptop and Nina's canvases, and a drive that would record everything from the moment the first car came up the road on Saturday morning until the last door closed. I had one job this weekend. Not to confront. Confrontation without containment is just noise. Not to accuse. Accusation without evidence is just grief. My job was to be the architect of a space in which the truth had nowhere left to hide. Gideon left at 9 Friday evening, driving out the 11 miles to position himself where he'd arranged to be. Not at the cabin, which would register to Arthur's eye, but at a location 3 miles down the road with a clear radio link to the storage room system and a phone line that reached Valerie's contact at the prosecutor's office. I stood on the cabin's front step and watched his headlights disappear into the tree line. The valley was absolutely silent. I went inside, built the fire up properly, and sat in the chair closest to the window where Nina had always preferred to read. Her last canvas from this place was still on the wall, a painting of the valley in early morning, the light the particular pale gold of high-altitude autumn, done in the loose, confident style she'd developed in her last years when she'd stopped caring about precision and started caring only about truth. I looked at it for a long time. The hard angles of the room softened, blurring into the past, Nina at that window with her morning coffee, telling me the light here was different from anywhere else she'd painted, that it had a quality she'd never quite managed to capture and kept returning to try again. Her laugh when I suggested she'd captured it perfectly, the dismissive wave of a brush-stained hand. Not yet, Max. Not yet. My phone found a fragment of signal near the window, enough for one message, which had arrived from Oliver 40 minutes ago and which I had not yet opened. I opened it now. We'll be there by noon tomorrow, all of us. I set the phone face down on the arm of the chair. The fire settled. The valley held its silence. Somewhere in those 3 words, all of us, I heard the thing Oliver didn't know he was telling me, that he had not come to this weekend alone, that Arthur had made sure of it, that whatever Arthur had decided in the 48 hours since the courtroom, he had decided it required everyone present. I looked at Nina's painting. Not yet, I thought, but tomorrow. They arrived at 12:17. Arthur's car first, the black sedan, unhurried up the unpaved road, parking with the precision of a man who had noted the terrain on arrival and filed it for future reference. Then Oliver's car, 30 seconds behind, slightly crooked in the pull-off, the way Oliver always parked when his mind was somewhere else. I watched from the window. Fiona stepped out first from Oliver's car, which told me something about the dynamic of that particular journey. She stood in the mountain air and looked at the cabin with the calm, assessing a tension of someone cataloging exits. Arthur emerged from his own car, moving easily despite the cane, collar turned up against the November cold, and looked at the property with an expression that resembled appreciation and was probably calculation. Oliver came last. He stood beside his car for a moment before moving, looking up at the tree line rather than the cabin, and something in the set of his shoulders, the particular defeated geometry of a man carrying a weight he has stopped pretending isn't there, told me that whatever Arthur had said to him in the 48 hours since the courtroom, it had not been reassuring. Good. I opened the front door before they reached it. Let's put the past behind us, I said, and smiled the smile of a man who meant it and stood back to let them in. The afternoon was a performance in which everyone knew their lines, and no one acknowledged the script. Arthur moved through the cabin with the proprietary ease of a frequent guest, which he had been, for 30 years, touching the back of chairs, commenting on the view, accepting the whiskey I poured him with the warm appreciation of a man on a genuine holiday. He talked about the firm, about a commission that had come in, about the industry generally, and I listened and responded with the attentiveness of a man who had no agenda beyond the weekend. Fiona organized the kitchen with an efficiency that looked like helpfulness and functioned as surveillance. She noted the layout, the storage, the positioning of every room she could access under the cover of preparing dinner. I watched her from the main room and understood that she was doing precisely what I would do, establishing the geography of a place she might need to navigate quickly. Oliver drank steadily and spoke minimally, which was the one unrehearsed element of the afternoon. He sat near the fire and looked into it, and occasionally his phone appeared in his hand from reflex, and then disappeared again when he remembered there was no signal. No signal, no exit, 11 miles of unpaved road. I had built this place. I knew every door, every window, every structural decision I'd made 30 years ago. I had designed the trap and I was standing inside it, and that, I had concluded, was the only position from which it could be properly operated. The storm arrived at dusk. It came in from the north the way mountain storms do, quickly, without the gradual overture of coastal weather, the sky simply reorganizing itself from gray to something darker and more definitive. By 7 o'clock the wind was moving through the tree line with enough force to shift the timbers, and the rain against the windows had the quality of sustained percussion. The valley disappeared. We were, in the most practical sense, alone. Dinner was Arthur's performance, as it always had been. He had brought food, prepared the main course himself with the confidence of a man who understood that feeding people was a form of control, keeping conversation light and warm, directing the evening the way a conductor directs music that everyone else believes is spontaneous. I ate and listened and waited. After dinner, Arthur opened a bottle of wine he'd brought, different vintage from the one he'd served at his estate, but I noted the same unhurried ceremony of the pour. I accepted the glass and held it, and did not drink, and watched Oliver pour his third significant measure of the evening over the rim of his glass. Arthur excused himself to the bathroom at 9:15. The moment the hallway door closed, I moved. Not loudly, not with the dramatic urgency of confrontation. I'd spent 2 weeks understanding that Oliver's particular psychology did not respond to attack. He was a man who had spent his adult life finding ways to disappear from conflict. Attack would produce the same response: retreat, denial, a closed door. What Oliver could not disappear from was precision. I sat beside him on the long bench closest to the fire, close enough that the conversation required no raising of voices, and I placed the first folder on the table in front of him without a word. He looked at it. "Did you know she kills her husbands, Oliver?" I said it quietly, the way you deliver information to someone who needs a moment to understand that the ground has changed beneath them. Not as an accusation, as a question from a father to a son, with all the specific sorrow that entails. He went very still. I opened the folder. The Georgia records first, the probate filing, the death certificate, the photograph of the woman currently in my kitchen, moving efficiently around the geography of a cabin she was assessing for reasons that were now, in this light, perfectly legible. I watched Oliver's eyes move across the page and find the photograph and stop. "That's not," he started, and could not finish the sentence. Her name in Georgia was different. I turned the page. In Colorado it was different again. The men were 63 and 67. Both cardiac events, both preceded by a cardiologist referral, both estates settled within 8 months. I paused. "The same timeline as your father's supplements, Oliver, the same compound, the same methodology." His breathing had changed. Shallower, faster, the respiratory signature of a man whose body is processing something his mind is refusing. "2 dead men," I said, "2 massive payouts. And now she's in my kitchen." "Dad," his voice broke on the single syllable. "She didn't choose you because she loves you." I said it without cruelty, which was the hardest thing I have ever done in a room. "She chose you because you were the access point. Because marrying you put her inside my life, inside my estate, inside the architecture of everything your mother and I built." I held his gaze. "And someone introduced her to you knowing exactly what she was." The fire shifted. Rain drove against the windows. "Arthur," Oliver said. It was barely a word, more like an exhale that happened to have a name in it. "Tell me," I said. The boy I raised sobbed like a trapped animal. Not performatively, this was not the careful sadness he deployed across dinner tables and courtrooms. This was the sound of a structure collapsing from the inside, the specific grief of a person who has been carrying the weight of an unconfessable thing for long enough that the relief of release and the terror of consequence arrive simultaneously and indistinguishably. He told me about the debt first. The offshore accounts, the gambling, the specific night 2 years ago when the number had become a figure he could not hide or service or minimize any further. Arthur had known. Arthur had always had peripheral visibility into Oliver's finances through the firm's structure. And Arthur had appeared with the debt retired, and a conversation that Oliver had told himself at the time was simply the pragmatic problem-solving of an older man who understood how these things worked. The conversation had a shape Oliver recognized only afterward. Arthur would hold the debt. Oliver would provide access. Access to me, to my routines, to my medical history, to the specific domestic geography of a man who trusted his son unreservedly. He said he just wanted to protect the firm, Oliver said, his voice unsteady. He said you'd been making decisions that endangered everything. He said he made it sound like stewardship, like we were protecting something. And Nina. A long silence, the rain. I didn't know, Oliver said. About Mum, I didn't know that was Arthur said her heart was already, he stopped. I didn't know, Dad. I looked at my son's face and made the assessment that I had been preparing myself to make since the night I'd read Gideon's file by lamplight. He was telling the truth. Not about everything, not about the petition, not about the forged transfer, not about the supplements he'd watched Fiona place in my cabinet with practiced hands. Those he had known about and permitted. But about Nina, about the specific, irreversible fact of what had been done to her on that morning. He hadn't known. It did not absolve him, but it was the truth and it mattered, and I filed it. Say it again, I said quietly, all of it from the beginning. He didn't understand why I was asking him to repeat it. He didn't know about the ceiling beams. He said it again. I heard Arthur before I saw him. The particular sound of the cane on the hardwood, a rhythm I had known for 2 years, since the knee procedure, since the cane had become his signature the way the suits and the smile were his signature. He had been in the hallway, not the bathroom. The hallway, outside the door, for some portion of what Oliver and I had just said to each other. I did not know how much he had heard. His face, when he came into the room, told me everything. The warmth was gone. Simply gone, not replaced by anger, which would have been a kind of mask, but stripped away entirely to reveal what had always been underneath it. A cold, extraordinary precision. The face of a man doing arithmetic. He looked at Oliver first. Oliver, who could not assemble his expression into anything coherent. Oliver, who was sitting beside his father with a folder of evidence on the table between them and tear tracks on his face. Arthur's gaze moved to me. And something happened that I had not anticipated and have not forgotten. He smiled. Not the dinner party smile, not the warmth that stops at the eyes, something different. Unguarded, for the first time in 40 years of knowing him. The expression of a man who has decided that containment is no longer possible or necessary and has arrived, with something close to relief, at the point where he simply does not need to pretend anymore. Arthur finally smiled his true smile, the smile of a monster finally in a room where the door is closed and the performance is over. How long, he said, looking at me. Not a question about the recording, not about the evidence. Something older than any of that. Long enough, I said. You always were, he stopped, tilted his head slightly, started differently. Do you know what it is, Max, to spend 40 years building something and watching someone else put their name on it? Not because they were better, because they were luckier, because the right woman looked at them instead of at you. Nina, I said. Nina, the name in his mouth had a texture I had never heard before because he had never allowed it. She looked at you in 1984 and that was the decision. That single, arbitrary decision, and everything else followed from it. Your firm, your reputation, your family. He looked around the cabin, Nina's painting on the wall, the firelight, the life she and I had built in every detail of this room. All of it should have been mine. All of it was mine, in every version of events except the one that actually happened. So you killed her. I balanced an account, he said. That's all it was. The fire, the rain, the ceiling beams. Oliver made a sound I will not try to describe. Arthur looked at him with something close to contempt. Stop, he said. You knew what this required. You agreed to it. I agreed to the petition, Oliver said, his voice shaking. I agreed to the transfer. I didn't agree to. You agreed to everything the moment you took my money. Arthur's voice carried the flat authority of someone stating a financial fact. The debt made you mine. That's how it works. He looked back at me. You've been recording this, he said. It was not a question. A conclusion, arrived at with the same methodical intelligence that had constructed the entire conspiracy. He had heard enough in the hallway, had looked at the folder on the table and at Oliver's broken composure, and had performed the arithmetic in the seconds since he'd entered the room. Yes, I said. He looked at me for a long moment. Then he set the cane against the arm of the chair, deliberately, unhurried, the gesture of a man who has decided on his final position, and sat down across from me and looked into the fire and said nothing more. Outside, the storm moved through the valley with everything it had. I reached into my jacket pocket and pressed the single button on the small transmitter Gideon, and I had agreed on. 3 miles down the road, a phone would be ringing. They came up the road at 11:43 p.m. I heard them before I saw them, the low, purposeful sound of vehicles moving without urgency through the dark, the kind of approach that announces itself not with speed but with certainty. 3 sets of headlights appearing at the tree line, cutting through the rain in slow, deliberate arcs as the road bent toward the cabin. Arthur heard them too. He was still sitting across from me, the cane propped against the chair arm, looking at the fire with the stillness of a man who had made his final calculation and found the result unsurprising. When the headlights swept across the window, he did not move, did not look up. The only change was a slight settling of his shoulders, the physical grammar of a man releasing a weight he had been carrying for a very long time. Fiona came out of the kitchen at the sound of the vehicles. She stood in the doorway between the kitchen and the main room and assessed the situation in approximately 2 seconds. Arthur's posture, Oliver's devastated stillness, the folders on the table, the approaching lights, and her face did the thing I had not seen it do in all the months of watching her perform warmth and concern and wifely attentiveness. It went completely empty. Not frightened, not angry, empty in the way of a mechanism that has been switched off. The performance discontinued. She looked at me. I looked back. She moved toward the hallway, not running, calculating, and Gideon was already through the front door. He came in with 2 investigators behind him, badges visible, and he moved through the cabin with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had memorized its layout from a schematic. He looked at the room, Arthur by the fire, Oliver on the bench, Fiona stopped in the hallway, and then at me. One look, a nod, everything accounted for. The investigators separated without instruction, one to Fiona, one to the main room. Arthur stood when they approached him. Not quickly, with a deliberate, considered rise, the cane retrieved and placed, the jacket straightened with the hand that wasn't holding it. He extended his wrists with the composure of a man who had decided, somewhere in the last 40 minutes, that dignity was the only remaining currency worth spending. The handcuffs clicked, ending a 40-year lie. The sound was very small in that large room, smaller than I'd expected. 40 years of envy and architecture, and a dead woman and a poisoned dog and a forged signature and a 10-month medical fraud. And the sound it made at its conclusion was a small metallic click, like a door latch, like something being closed. Arthur looked at me one final time as they turned him toward the door. The true smile was gone. What replaced it was something I had no name for, not remorse, not defeat exactly. Perhaps simply the expression of a man seeing clearly, for the first time, the full distance between what he had wanted and what he had actually built. I did not look away. He walked out through the front door of the cabin I had designed with my own hands, into the November rain, and I watched him go. Oliver did not stand when they came to him. He was still on the bench where I'd left him, the folder open on the table, and he looked up at the investigator with the specific exhaustion of someone who has been anticipating this moment long enough that its arrival is almost a relief. He stood when asked slowly, and he held out his hands with a cooperativeness that had nothing performing in it. My son couldn't look me in the eye as they led him toward the door. He tried once. His face turned in my direction and then turned away again, and I understood that the thing preventing the look was not defiance. Oliver had run out of defiance somewhere around the third whiskey and the photograph of Fiona in Georgia. What prevented it was something rower and less manageable. The specific shame of a man confronting the distance between who his father believed he was and what he had actually done. At the door he stopped. The investigator waited. "Dad," his voice was barely functional. I crossed the room and stood in front of my son, and I looked at him for a long moment. This man I had taught to ride a bicycle, whose college application essays I had edited at midnight, who had robbed me and signed his name to a document calling me incompetent, and permitted a woman with a history of killing her husbands to place poisoned capsules in my kitchen cabinet. "I know," I said. Not forgiveness. Not yet, and perhaps not ever. That was a question for a version of the future I couldn't see from where I was standing. But acknowledgement. The recognition that the complicated, terrible truth of what had happened between us was something I would carry and examine and eventually, in whatever way became possible, reckon with. It was the most I had. He nodded once and went through the door. Fiona was already in the second vehicle. She had said nothing during the entire arrest, not a protest, not an explanation, not a single word. She had looked at the investigator's badge and made the assessment of someone calculating odds, and her silence had been the silence of a woman who understood that anything she said would be recorded and used, and had therefore decided to offer nothing. Even now, even at the end of her third and most ambitious methodology, the professionalism held. Dr. Aris was arrested at his home, I learned later, at the same time we were at the cabin. Gideon had coordinated the timing with the precision that characterized everything he did, simultaneous, so that no single arrest could produce a phone call that warned the others. The cabin emptied. Gideon retrieved the drive from the storage room, initialed it, sealed it in an evidence bag in front of the investigator's body camera. He handed it over with the careful formality of a man who understood that this moment, the chain of custody, the documentation, the unimpeachable record of transfer, was as important as everything that had preceded it. He came back into the main room and looked at me. "It's done," he said. I looked at Nina's painting on the wall. The valley in early morning light, that particular pale gold she had never quite felt she'd captured. "Not yet," I said, "but close." The sentencing was in March. 4 months during which I had returned to the house, and the studio, and the firm, and the ordinary daily structure of a life that had been systematically dismantled, and was now, piece by piece, being reconstructed, not into what it had been, because that was neither possible nor, I had come to understand, desirable, into something that knew more. That had been tested against the worst available pressure and had held. The drive had given the prosecution everything. Arthur's confession, I balanced an account, was, Valerie told me, the most unambiguous recorded admission she had encountered in 20 years of evidentiary work. The 40-year motive stated plainly. Nina's death, characterized without legal euphemism. Dr. Aris had entered a plea. Fiona's silence had not protected her from the Georgia and Colorado documentation, the toxicology, the surgeon's daughter who finally had a room where someone was listening and had used it with 4 years of accumulated precision. Oliver had cooperated fully with the prosecution. This was noted by the judge. I sat in the same row of the same courthouse where Valerie had filed the counterpetition 5 months earlier, and I watched each of them receive what the evidence, methodically and unimpeachably assembled, had determined they were owed. Arthur received the longest sentence. He sat through the reading of it in the 3-piece suit, without the cane, which had been deemed unnecessary by the facility he would be transferred to. His face during the reading was the face of a man listening to a piece of music he found neither surprising nor particularly interesting. At the end, when the gavel came down, he looked straight ahead. He did not look at me. I had spent some portion of the preceding months wondering how I would feel in this moment, whether there would be satisfaction, or grief, or the complicated mixture of both that Nina's death had produced every day for the past year and a half. What I felt, watching the handcuffs from the cabin replaced now by the full, formal apparatus of consequence, was quieter than any of those things. I felt the specific, exhausted relief of a load-bearing wall that is held. The handcuffs had clicked in November, ending a 40-year lie. The gavel came down in March, ending it again, more permanently, in the language that a civilization uses to say, "This is what we have decided this cost." I sat with it until the room began to empty. Oliver's sentencing was the last. He had cooperated. He had provided testimony that corroborated the drive's recordings and filled in the pre-cabin history with the granular detail of a man who had been present for its construction. The judge noted this, and the sentence reflected it, and I will not describe the specific terms because they belong to Oliver and to whatever he does with the years that follow from them. What I will describe is the moment before the gavel. He turned from the dock and found me in the gallery, and this time he did not look away. My son couldn't look me in the eye as the judge read the sentence. I had expected this, had prepared for it, but at the end, after the reading in the brief space before the gavel, he found my face. I don't know what he saw there. I don't know entirely what was there to see. Something unresolved. Something that was not yet forgiveness and was not hatred, which put it somewhere in the difficult, necessary territory between those two things where most of the actual work of living gets done. The gavel came down. He nodded once, barely perceptible. Then he was gone through the side door. I sat in the empty gallery for a few minutes after the room cleared. In the way I've always needed stillness after a structure is completed, time to walk through it without purpose, to understand it now that the building is finished and the work of building is over. Then I drove home. The house was quiet in the way that houses become quiet when they are no longer being listened to. I had swept every room after November. Gideon had helped, the same methodical room-by-room attention he'd given the cabin, finding 2 devices I hadn't located on my own. They were gone now. The smoke detector above the kitchen table was a smoke detector. The hallway was simply a hallway. I stood in the front hall for a moment, looking at the photographs Nina had arranged on the wall. Porto, her niece's wedding, Oliver at 16, pretending to hate every photograph. Then I walked to the end of the hall and opened the studio door. It smelled still of linseed oil and turpentine, that particular Nina smell that I had spent 14 months unable to face and would now, I had decided, spend the rest of my life unwilling to let fade. The drop cloth was still pulled back where Toby had worked, though Toby had long since returned and finished the job he'd been hired for. The faucet was finally fixed, and the house was quiet again. Not empty. Quiet, the specific, inhabited quiet of a room that still held the presence of someone who had worked in it with intention and care for 30 years. Nina's canvases along the wall, her brushes, which I had cleaned. The easel she'd left with a half-finished painting that I had decided, after considerable thought, to leave exactly as she'd left it. I set my drafting case on her work table. Not the leather one with the false bottom, that was evidence, logged and sealed. A new one, purchased last month, which I had broken in over 6 weeks of returning to actual work at the firm. The firm that had my name on the door, and now, a partnership structure that I had rebuilt from foundation level with Valerie's guidance and a forensic accountant's help, the rot cleared out, the load-bearing elements restored. I opened the case and took out the drawings I'd been developing for the past 8 weeks. They were preliminary, the early-stage drawings of a project, the rough structural thinking before the refinement begins. A building, modest in scale, ambitious in intention, community-facing, designed for the specific, practical needs of people in the kind of danger that announces itself quietly through small deteriorations, a forged signature here, a prescribed supplement there, a clock that does something other than tell time. A foundation named for Nina. Not a memorial, I was precise about this distinction with everyone who had heard the plan. Not a backward-looking thing, not a monument to loss. A forward-facing structure, designed to do what Nina had done in that hidden room behind the studio wall. Identify the mechanism, document it, build something that would hold up under the worst available pressure. I spread the drawings across her work table and sat in the chair she had always used, the one with the paint on the left arm from a day 30 years ago when she gestured too widely and I'd laughed, and she'd told me it was abstract expressionism, which became one of those small, permanent, domestic jokes that survive everything, and I looked at what I'd made so far. The hard angles of the room did not blur this time. I did not go back. I stayed in the present, in the studio, in the quiet house, with the drawings in front of me and the smell of her work in the walls, and the faucet silent and the hallway undisturbed, and the valley of the future, whatever it held, waiting at the edge of the page where the drawings had not yet been made. I picked up my pen. I began.